In our cultures, we have the aunties, and the aunties are not even necessarily your blood aunties. They are just women who are very present in your life.
This is Writer's Mosaic, in conversation. Poet Bashabi Fraser talks to author Mara Menzies about her Kenyan heritage and Scottish experience.
Hello, I'm Bashabi Fraser, and today we are delighted to have Mara Menzies with us at Writer's Mosaic, who's a consummate storyteller, novelist, and performing artist, has won several awards in each of the genres she practices. Thank you, Mara, for agreeing to be a profile writer for our platform. Your contribution to literature and the arts has been phenomenal, as your storytelling powers have mesmerized audiences on stage and radio, and your debut novel, Blood and Gold, won the prestigious Best First Book Award from the Saltaire Society, Scotland, in 2022. Congratulations and welcome. I know you were born and brought up in Scotland, but you have the advantage of a rich dual heritage that is both Kenyan and Scottish. Would you like to tell us how your Kenyan heritage and Scottish experience have shaped your perspective as a writer and storyteller?
Thank you, Bashabi. And yes, it's been a real privilege actually to have this dual cultural heritage. I grew up in Kenya and I spent the first 13 years of my life there. And as a teenager, then I moved to Scotland. And my mother is Kenyan and my father is Scottish. So when I grew up in Kenya, it was not in a city, it was in quite a rural environment. And so we were very used to having people come over for dinner, for us to go over and spend time with other families, other people. My mother was a wonderful storyteller. So I grew up with this very beautiful experience of hearing and listening to stories all the time. And then, of course, as a teenager, when I moved to Edinburgh, which I guess some people might say is the literary capital of the world, then of course you are exposed to stories, but in a very, very different way. And so I grew up with very, very strong oral tradition, storytelling, and literature experiences in both throughout my entire childhood and right through to adulthood as well. And it's not just the stories that I read, the stories that I heard. It's just I suppose the way the landscape informs you, the way your experiences with people from very, very different walks of life, how they shape and influence your understanding of the world that you live in. So I really feel that I've been very privileged to come at the world from multiple perspectives, whether that is going to visit my grandmother who lived in the village, or visiting the town, or going to a number of different schools, you know, from sitting under a tree to a very wonderful British boarding school as a child, as a young child. And then the landscape once we moved to Scotland. So you know, the Highlands and the Islands, and living in a very different place from the Indian Ocean right through to, you know, ancient stone buildings in the city of Edinburgh. So all of these things have helped shape my perspective as a writer and storyteller.
You know, as you were speaking, I was thinking what a wonderful storyteller you are, and the way you described your life and your dual heritage. You've shown how significant stories are in people's lives, often unfolding and holding a whole community's history in an oral tradition that has been handed down from generation to generation. When did you first realize how powerful stories are? Could you tell us who the people are who have gifted you these stories that have helped you to understand and be proud of your identity and history?
It's a great question, Bashabi, because there's no simple answer to it. I think as I grew up as a child, I had absolutely no idea how powerful stories are, because you're simply absorbing them and taking them into yourself. And I actually started the storytelling in my late 20s. And it was when I was pregnant with my first child. And I knew that this child, we were living in Scotland, would have a very strong Scottish cultural identity. But because I'm very proud of my African identity, I wanted the child to have access to that as well. And so I felt the best way was through stories. And because I knew all these stories from when I grew up, I thought, let me find some books because maybe that is the best way to pass these stories on. And actually, I couldn't find any of the stories that I grew up with. And so I thought, oh, I'm going to write a book for my baby. And so I wrote this little book called Coco the Crocodile, and I published 1,000 copies of it. And I tried to sell the copies, and my friends and family all bought one, and I still had 900 and something copies left. So I would then go to halls and community centers, and I would invite members of the public to hear the story in the hope that they would buy the book. And it was through that experience that I looked down when I was telling the story, because I never read from the book. I always just told the story in whichever way it felt was necessary to come out. And I saw how the little children would respond to that story. Their eyes would widen when I would talk about the crocodile. They would get very excited when the monkey appeared on the scene. And I began to think and feel that, oh, they really like it when I do this. Oh, this really gets their attention. So the storytelling itself began to emerge from that experience, because then I could see the actual impact of telling a story, what that had on the audience in front of me. So I guess there was power in that. But I feel that actually one story that my mother told me when I was in my 30s was a personal story about my grandparents and how my grandfather had basically helped shape and change the trajectory of my family history by choosing to educate his daughters, because he and my grandmother had three daughters, of which my mother was the eldest. And he educated the girls, and it went against the tradition of the family. So it was not met with grace or respect or any positivity. And in fact, in the end, they poisoned my grandfather. And there's a wife inheritance tradition, which means that when a man dies, his brother would assume responsibility of all of his property, of all of his life, which includes the wife and the children. So my grandmother's destiny was then to marry her brother-in-law, and she decided that she did not want that life at all. And my grandmother she was not an educated woman. She came from a very small village where women were really not given any value whatsoever. So she decided to run away with her three girls, which was an incredibly brave and courageous thing to do, because she knew nobody, she had no money, she couldn't read. There was nothing in her life that could have prepared her for anything outside that village, a very small world. And because she had nothing, she ended up putting my mother in an orphanage. And my mother was raised by Scottish nuns, which was her first introduction to Scotland. And it was through that process that a woman in Scotland sponsored her to go and study nursing in Edinburgh in the 1960s. And so that was how my mother came to be in Scotland. And she told me the story, and it completely changed how I saw my family, because suddenly this man, my grandfather, I realized that he was such an incredible human being. He was a real feminist. He stuck to his values. And then his wife, my grandmother, was this phenomenal woman. And that particular story really struck me. And that was when I actually thought, my God, the power that stories have on us as individuals, and how a lot can change within one generation simply by the stories that we tell ourselves and the decisions that we choose to make. So I guess in my this late 20s, early 30s, that is when I really began to understand the power of storytelling. And since then, I guess that the way I tell the stories changes. There's a lot more thought that goes into the crafting of a narrative, and what is it actually that you're trying to say. And so when I'm creating a story, a lot of research goes into the sociological aspects, political aspects, the cultural aspects, what is happening at a particular time and space, and how can that all be used in a very personal way to help push the story forward.
Mm, marvelous. You've actually answered a couple of my questions which I had. And that's beautiful because you show the magical power of storytelling. It's a gift you have inherited, but a gift you actually also have yourself, um, because you choreograph your performance, which I know, as the reviews say, is magical. And then you use this whole experience to write your book, which won the Saltaire Society Best First Book Award. You've done this quite effortlessly and with artistic finesse, and it covers the history of colonial exploitation and the scars inflicted on a continent by slavery. It depicts intense suffering and heroic resilience in a tale of love, loss, and recovery, told through multiple voices. And I've noticed that you have a lot of women's voices who play significant roles in Blood and Gold. And as you've just said, your grandmother was a remarkable woman. Your mother's whole life changed with education. And also, your grandfather seems to be a remarkable feminist in his time, bless him. So I was just wondering, when you told your story in print, Blood and Gold, you see that these multiple voices stride across time and space. So, what decisions as a writer did you take to weave these stories into an intricate tapestry for your fictional narrative?
This was quite a difficult thing to do, the transition from performance storytelling into literature. I struggled with it quite a bit at the beginning because my artistic expression is through performance. And when you are telling the story, you're not just relying on the words. In fact, we say that the words are probably the least important part of the telling of a story because so much is conveyed in the non-verbal communication. So through your facial expressions, through your physicality, the way you move your body, the way your fingers can reach out and actually you can be quite tactile with the audience. And then of course with literature, the words are everything because there is nothing else. There is the words, and that is how you convey your story. And so to transition from performance storytelling into literature took a little while to get used to. And I remember sitting down at the table with the laptop, and I had my glass of water and I had a little snack nearby, and I felt I was now getting into writer mode. And do you know, nothing came. I sat there and I sat there, and it was impossible for me to type. It felt very sluggish, quite slow. The ideas were not flowing in the way that they do when I'm telling the story. And so then I came up with an idea, a thought, and I used a voice typing tool. So what I did is that I actually told the story verbally. So I would just tell a whole chapter of the story, and then I would go through it line by line, and I would fix all the grammatical errors that the voice typing had picked up. And then also I would then be able to infuse each sentence with a sense of the feeling that would otherwise have been conveyed through the non-verbal communication. So when you're performing, you don't have to say that she sighed because you can demonstrate that physically. But when you are writing it, then you have to make sure the audience understands exactly what's happening through the words. So that is actually how I sat down to create Blood and Gold as a literary piece. And what I feel helped in that process is I am a storyteller and I love the oral tradition. I love the sense of having a relationship between the storyteller and the audience, or the storyteller and the listener, or the storyteller and the reader. And I really wanted to be able to convey that storytelling magic, that once upon a time feeling through the words without really losing any of the magic that people do experience when they are observing somebody performing or telling or sharing a story. And so I really wanted to keep to the root of storytelling. So even the context of the story, the shape of the story, it is about stories flying out of this box that this mother has gifted to her daughter. And so in that frame, in that style, I was, I think, able to maintain a sense of that storytelling tradition that I grew up with and that I continue to perpetuate to this day.
I think that's an amazing tip for any writer. that the whole voice recognition thing, but also going back and making it work on the page itself. Great transformative power that you have as a writer. That's brilliant. In Blood and Gold, you have a mother, a grandmother, an aunt who are powerful voices in the book. And as you say, I love the way the stories escape from this box. And you're right. I mean, Salman Rushdie calls himself a storyteller. And Somerset Maugham, who has funded the Royal Literary Fund greatly, talks about how it's inherent in human beings to want to listen to stories. So the mother, grandmother, and aunt are all women's voices. Was this a conscious choice in your novel?
Having women at the forefront of everything was actually not a conscious choice. But I feel that in my life they are such strong characters. My mother is one of the most incredible people that I know. My grandmother had a huge influence on me. The aunt in the story is actually she stems from a collection of very wonderful women who I surround myself with. And in our cultures we have the aunties, and the aunties are not even necessarily your blood aunties. They are just women who are very present in your life. And some of them are very soft and gentle and loving and nurturing. And others, their role is to wake you up and shake you up a little bit and say, Mara, what on earth are you doing? They slap you around a little bit and pull you out of your stupor, and just force you to recognize your behaviors or your decision making or the choices that you're making. And so these women, all of them, these different characteristics, they all sort of formed and merged into the role of auntie in the story, because I feel that the women in our lives, particularly I'm a woman and I draw heavily from the experiences of other women. I just felt that it's a really beautiful place because this is where we get our information, our wisdom. These are the lessons that we learn from the experiences of women who have come before us, and they have made their own mistakes. And if they are willing to share those mistakes with us so that our lives can be better, then it seems a beautiful gift to not take advantage of. And also I feel that traditionally the women have always been the storytellers. You would sit with the grandmother and the grandmother would tell the stories, and as a child my mother would tell a lot of stories. So definitely stories have been passed down in a more matriarchal form in my experience. Not in everyone's necessarily, but certainly in mine, the women were the storytellers. And I also feel that sometimes with the folklore, the fables, a lot of people associate storytelling in quite a simplistic way, as opposed to literature, which seems grander and more important. And therefore what happened a lot of the time is that it was left for the women to do that storytelling, while the men could concentrate on literature in some ways, particularly here from the Scottish side, from the European side of my family. And so when the storytelling is being passed down, it's almost a really wonderful way that, and a freedom that women have to actually say whatever it is that they want, because they were not allowed to write literature, or they were not allowed to enter into certain areas. And so through stories, this is how the wisdom and the knowledge and the experiences of women have always been passed down. So for me, having those roles was not conscious, but it was totally in me, and that is how it needed to come out.
Wonderful. I mean, I love the idea of the collective women's voice and the freedom and, how enriched we are. And you're passing this on to your children. So I know, Mara, you like working with children and use your storytelling methods as educational tools that help the children to know who they are and where they come from. Could you share some of your projects with us that have made a difference for some children?
I'll share a couple of stories. One story was in Kenya, because I travel back and forth between the two quite frequently. And I remember going to a school and I told a story from the Gikuyu people, who are the largest ethnic group in Kenya. We have 44 different ethnic groups, and the Gikuyu are the largest. And I told a story about this woman who challenged the tradition where women were not allowed to eat meat. And this woman faced a lot of oppression, a lot of judgment. She was punished. Her husband was punished as well. And the outcome of this story is that, after she has defied everything, defied tradition, gone through all of these awful experiences, finally she is able to get what she wants, essentially, and the women are allowed to eat meat. Through some kind of divine intervention, there's a role of an eagle that comes in who drops the meat to this woman in front of all the men. So they see this as a sign from God. And so I told this story, and it's a very, very beautiful story. And at the end of this story, this little girl came to me. She must have been about 9 or 10 years old. And she said to me very proudly, she said, I am Gikuyu. And the way she said it, it was, this is my story. I'm taking ownership of this story. So clearly there was something in it that was very important for her. And I just remember that particular anecdote so clearly. And in Scotland, I was involved with a lovely school, Craigroyston Primary School, and it was a storytelling residency. And some of the children in that school had never been to Edinburgh city centre, which is, maybe a 25-30 minute bus ride. And so I was telling stories from the city, from, the stories of Edinburgh. These are the stories of place. These are our stories. These are your stories. These are the stories that have helped to shape this community and this nation that we live in. And so it was really wonderful to actually be able to engage these children in actually seeing some of these stories and hearing them for the very, very first time. And these are stories that are literally on their doorstep, but they had absolutely no recognition or awareness of at all. And then when they realized that these stories belong to them, then suddenly the questions started to come out in floods. And it was, well, what about this? And what about the castles? And what about the cobblestones? And what about those closes? And when we hear these stories, it generates curiosity and interest, because when you know one story, then automatically it makes you interested in finding out more. And so that was a really, really special project for me, just because we live in a city, and it's tragic if we live in a place and we have no actual understanding of the stories that have helped to shape that place, because that is how we put roots into the ground. That is how we root ourselves into a people and a place. It's only through the stories.
Absolutely. And I love that story about the ownership of the little Kenyan girl, of her heritage, and the dignity and a sense of identity that you've given children in Edinburgh as well. You work with community groups and encourage them to share their stories. I know you have a very creative approach to building social awareness, as you've just shown us by the two stories you told us. A social awareness of diversity and promoting understanding and acceptance here in Scotland. Could you tell us how you embarked on these projects and what it was that continues to be most rewarding in the outcomes of the projects that you undertake today? And then I'll come to one of your major projects.
I think when it comes to the building social awareness of diversity and, and as you've said, sort of promoting the understanding, there's been quite a few projects that I've been involved with. A lot of these projects have been with young people, so from the ages of 16 to 25 kind of age group. And one of the things that has really affected me or has been imprinted on me is that often I feel extremely fortunate because I grew up in Kenya and I also grew up in Scotland. So I have a very definite dual cultural heritage identity, and I feel fully Scottish and I feel fully Kenyan at the same time. But I also understand that for so many other people, it's not the same experience. So that question of where do you come from, it doesn't bother me in any way, shape, or form, because I have multiple places that I come from. But for some people, it can come across as a negative question because they only belong to one place, and sometimes they also may not necessarily feel that they belong to one place. I remember watching a theatre show, and it was a woman who was from Jamaica, or originally, but she was Black British, and she felt that she was pushed away by Britain. She was pushed away from Jamaica. She was so far removed from Africa. that she didn't really feel any sense of belonging. And I felt a real sadness at listening to her story. And when you have young people who are trying to come to terms with identity and a sense of home and belonging and where do I come from and who am I, and they're besieged by a lot of different influences. At home, you've got the religious, cultural influences, you've got the cultural influences from school, and from the community around you. And sometimes people really struggle to find their place and feel that they fully belong in a place. And so a lot of the projects that I've been involved with was actually exploring that concept of home and exploring that concept of belonging and who are you and how do you fit into this place. And by going back, and we draw a lot of maps and we talk about how these maps and the places that these young people identify on these maps, tell us the stories of why this park is important to you, or why your grandmother's house is important to you, because sometimes that is something that comes up quite frequently. And a lot of the time, it's food draws people into a place, or, this is where I got involved in an altercation, or this is where I met my best friend, or all of these tiny little stories kind of help piece together the puzzle that all of these young people need to try and put together for themselves, because otherwise they feel quite scattered and quite fragmented. So I love these projects where we are actually able to bring people from very diverse social, cultural, ethnic backgrounds and actually talk about the things that are quite different about them, but at the same time, there are so many other similarities. And it's not a negative in any way. It's all of these experiences just add to a really beautiful tapestry of somebody else's life. And sharing these experiences actually brings people together, because even somebody who is, the relationships that we have with people, those are the things that are very similar, because we've all got, that person in our lives who is a terrible cook and makes us laugh. We've all got that person who is always late and is always frustrating, but all of these people are just wonderful in their own way, and it doesn't really matter where we come from. The relationships that we have with people, our families and our friends, those are the things that bind us together. So sharing these stories is a way that people can actually see how they can fit into a people and a place.
Wonderful. I think we have come to almost the end of our conversation, which has been fascinating. So I'm going to fit three questions together, and I'll let you answer them as compactly as you can, Mara. Your project, which is based on the Baobab Forest, the Forest of Dreams, which relates to the environment, community, and culture. And in your commission pieces, you talk about the responsibility of the writer to tell the truth. And I know you're working on your next novel. So, do you want to tell us about the Forest of Dreams, of the way you see truth should be told by a responsible writer, and how all this is going to shape your next novel?
Yes, it's a big question. So in a nutshell, so it's the Forest of Dreams in Kiswahili. It's Msitu wa Ndoto, so Forest of Dreams, and it's actually a project that was inspired by how I see Scotland using its stories. I see how everywhere we go, anywhere in Scotland, we see Greyfriars Bobby. There's the Loch Ness Monster. We've got all the stories of the ghosts, of the castles, of the Highlands and the Islands, of the fishing communities, of the people who have helped to shape the Scottish nation. And when I compare that with Kenya, in Kenya, we really don't celebrate our stories at all. And there's a few reasons for that, through colonialism, where the stories were taken away or forbidden. Religion is exactly the same thing. And also, our civilizations are not that strong, so it's easier to give stories away. And a lot of the legacy of all of these things is that, arts and culture and stories are seen as insignificant. And that for me is a very dangerous place to be, because when we lose these stories, we lose a lot of ourselves. So I went to Kenya, and I've just taken over this 150-acre forest. It's a beautiful baobab forest at the coast. And the plan is to fill it, to populate it with artworks and installations and sculptures and little storytelling trails and little performance spaces. And all of these are rooted in some kind of story from history, mythology, folklore. But it's really about getting people interested again and curious about the stories, because when they see and they feel the magic of these stories, then hopefully they will want to know more. And linking back into the idea of the forest, because I'm totally passionate about the natural environment, having the space to do that within a natural setting, I think is also really important. I feel that when you're in the natural world, whether you're out on the plains or hiking or in a forest or walking on the beach, nature itself helps with a sense of well-being, and when you are in a state of calm, of peace, then you actually find yourself more open to accepting things in a slightly different way. Whereas if we approach certain issues and we're already tense and we're already stressed and we already know what we want to say, then actually the truth of whatever that situation is much harder to experience. And I feel as a writer, we do have a responsibility to the truth. And that question of truth is quite complex. But it's about looking at things from multiple perspectives. And when you look at things from multiple perspectives, that is when you get towards something closer to the truth, because all of us have our own truths. And there's a lovely little story about people who were surrounding a mountain. They lived on at the base of a mountain. And when they asked one villager, "What is your mountain like?" they say, "Oh, it's beautiful with rolling green grass and it's wonderful." But the other villager got angry and said, "No, it's not. Stop lying. It's jagged and rocky and terrible." And the other one said, "Oh, both of you are wrong. It's icy." And all these villagers started to argue because they were unable to see the different perspectives of the mountain. So truth is a little bit like that. And as a writer, I feel that we do have a responsibility to look at all the truths surrounding anything that we're writing. And I guess there's a sense of that comes into the next novel that I'm working on. Again, I'm interested in exploring how nature lends itself to us as human beings and how we operate differently in that setting. But also I'm writing as from the perspective of a woman who is now in her 40s and is embarking on a new chapter in her life, and just sort of looking at how the different experiences that have led me to this point are actually now, how can I change them in some way, get rid of the things that are not really necessary, and actually begin to absorb a lot of the things that are probably innate within me. So that is kind of the influence for the next story, that is also inspired by a little folk tale about this woman who has the ability to turn herself into a leopard, and but she's afraid of turning herself into a leopard because of what happens, what she does, and what she is capable of when she is a leopard. So she decides that she is not going to unleash her leopardness until the time is right for her to do that. So it's a mixture of bringing my own personal experiences, infusing it again with a more fantastical fable in a sense, but exploring womanhood and nature.
Mara Menzies, we look forward to your next novel. We look forward to the magic. You're a fascinating storyteller, and we could listen to you forever. Thank you so much for being a profile writer for Writer's Mosaic today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mara Menzies was in conversation with Bashabi Fraser for Writer's Mosaic. To hear more writers, go to writersmosaic.org.uk.